Okay, so we're going to be looking at disorders and diseases of genetic origin. As the syllabus stipulates, we're going to be looking at phenylketonuria, cystic fibrosis, Huntington's disease, sickle cell anemia, and at least two examples of sex-linked conditions, which means these are diseases caused by malformations or mutations on the sex chromosomes. All right, so color blindness and hemophilia are the two we're going to be looking at. If we start with phenylketonuria, this is an autosomal recessive condition, which means that PKU is the letter that we use for symbolizing phenylketonuria. It is caused by increased levels of phenylalanine, which is an amino acid that tends to build up in the system, causing all sorts of problems when it fails to be converted to tyrosine by the enzyme phenylalanine hydroxylase. So this particular enzyme is responsible for converting the essential amino acid phenylalanine to tyrosine, which is a non-essential amino acid, although that is relatively unimportant at this particular moment in time. It's the phenylalanine hydroxylase, which is the crucial enzyme that we need to be working properly, that is coded for by our genes in order to do this conversion. All right, so it fails to actually develop, and structurally, of course, it means that it's not going to perform the function it is designed for. So the gene mutation results in a faulty, non-functioning enzyme, which means that it is not going to do the job it is destined to do. It is a missense mutation, so there's a base substitution involved, so refer back to that. And the gene responsible for making this enzyme is located on chromosome 12. So therefore it is an autosomal one. Any one of the genes, chromosomes 1 to 22, will be considered an autosome. So PKU is very much a genetic disorder, and it is an autosomal recessive condition as a result of a gene mutation. It is routinely tested for after birth in order to avoid long-term complications, because it is in fact a progressive condition. So, immediately, or rather on a short-term basis, a person can be put on a low phenylalanine diet and supplemented with tyrosine. So all these food products or food items are generally advised to limit or cut down meat, fish, nuts, cheese, beans, dairy, including breast milk and aspartame. The symptoms are pretty dramatic, so there are seizures in the body, brain seizures, which can lead to brain impairment, and in very young children, the growth of the head and the brain in a developing fetus can also happen, all because there is a buildup of phenylalanine. Okay, so we'll move on to cystic fibrosis. Now, this is an autosomal recessive condition, and the three potential genotypes in question are going to be as follows. The two homozygous normal, so the homozygous dominant, the carrier, so it's heterozygous, and the double recessive, which is going to result in cystic fibrosis. The symptoms are such that the thick mucus product that is produced in certain passages in the body is because there's a faulty chloride channel on chromosome 7, or faulty chloride channel that is actually produced as a result of malformations on the gene located on chromosome 7. So the CFTR is actually the protein being made. It's a transmembrane, and it is present in membranes of the lungs, salivary glands, pancreas, liver, kidneys, sweat glands, and reproductive tracts. As a result of this faulty chloride ion channel, there is an increased absorption of water from the mucus in certain parts of these of the body, in these specific tracts that we have just listed there, and this sticky mucus tend to kind of build up and causes these organs and structures to malfunction. So we have blocked airways, we have blocked passages, and the complications as a result of that. So if we took the gut and the reproductive structures, so the gastrointestinal tract, if it has a thick mucus, it's not going to really absorb the nutrients it's meant to, so there could be potentially malabsorption and deficiency disorders as a result of it. So they are often given enzymes and dietary supplements to combat that. If, on the other hand, reproductive tracts are blocked because of this thick mucus, this is going to lead to infertility, because obviously eggs and sperm need to go through certain reproductive tracts in order to get to their destination. So that's seriously problematic. Now, Huntington's disease is actually a dominant, caused by a dominant gene, and it is one of the rare conditions where you do have a dominant allele in question. All right, so you could have carriers is questionable simply because if it's a dominant, you're going to have the disease, but ostensibly if it's a homozygous dominant HDHD, then that's going to also be the case for the heterozygous. So the question of a carrier is in fact not really in question. All right, so it's a neurodegenerative disorder of autosomal dominance. It's a progressive breakdown of nerve cells in the brain, and it is caused by a dominant gene which codes for the protein Huntington. Now, Huntington is a protein, the function of which we don't fully yet know, is coded by this gene called HTT. All right, so any abnormality in the HTT gene leads to a malfunction or an abnormal protein Huntington, which is going to have consequences to the nerve damage and the nerve functioning, especially in the brain. All right, so this is very much a progressive condition. Sickle cell anemia is the next condition we're going to be looking at. Contrary to what that says, autosomal codominant, it's in fact an autosomal recessive. So we need to look at this. So ignore that word codominant, please. So it's an autosomal recessive condition. The gene mutation is that occurs in this condition is a single base change, and it is a gene that codes for the hemoglobin protein. All right, that particular protein is given the term HBB protein, but effectively this is the hemoglobin, the quaternary protein that is produced. This particular gene, HBB, is actually found on chromosome 11. All right, so the gene that codes for this is found on chromosome 11. So we have HBA to denote the normal HBB allele, HBS to denote the single cell HBS allele. All right, so you have the normal and the sickle. So if we were to look at the genotypes for both normal, it could be HBA, 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 SB, HBS. So normal, they are usually obviously healthy. Carriers are generally asymptomatic, which means they don't really suffer the consequences of the sickle, but they are in fact carriers. But the sickle cell needs to be a double recessive. So what exactly is causing this? So you have a glutamic acid being replaced by valine, which is going to be really problematic because it means that the hemoglobin assumes an abnormal shape, and the normal healthy biconcave disc of our red blood cells now assumes a sickle shape, which means that there is no space for the oxygen carriage on the hemoglobin. So if you can think back to what a crescent moon or a sickle looks like, that is very much the shape now of your red blood cells. All right, so we'll now move on to two examples of sex-linked conditions. So these are conditions that are associated with genes that are located on our sex chromosomes. Now this is slight variation, and again Mendel couldn't explain this because he didn't quite know how sex-linked conditions could happen. Bear in mind, females and males carry different genes or chromosomes, XX and XY. Depending on where you find the gene, the Y chromosomes, particularly in males, generally don't have the sectional chromosome to combat or counteract anything that is present on the X chromosome. So it's more often than not, sex-linked conditions tend to affect more males than females. But it's not to say that females are completely free from this. So all the ones that I have listed here, you have XX and XY. So if you took C, for example, for color blindness, being a recessive condition, you have, if for example for a female to be affected, they need to have both recessive genes, but for a male they only really need to have it on their X chromosome for it to be affected. Normal and unaffected, of course, are going to carry the both dominant genes, and they won't have that present at all. It is possible to be a carrier of color blindness, so males can never really be carriers in this regard, because if they did have the C gene on their X chromosome, because there's no counteractive part on their Y chromosomes, they're not really they're going to be affected if it's on the X chromosomes. So more often than not, this is really not up for discussion, because they don't really have a choice about that. If it's on the X, they're going to get it. Haemophilia, on the other hand, is not that dissimilar. So we have normal female, a carrier female, normal male, and an affected male in a very similar situation to colour blindness. So again, males can never really be carriers in any sex-linked disorders because they don't really have the counteractive part on their Y chromosome to combat what is present on their X chromosome. Now, codominance, again, this is another thing that Mendel couldn't explain. I have already mentioned blood grouping before, so this is another example of genetic diseases or disorders, but there's nothing really abnormal with the inheritance of blood groups, which I have already talked about. IA and IB are the ones that are going to be codominant. IO or small I is going to be the recessive. Alright, so if you looked at the four possible pairings within the ABO blood grouping system, these are the possible genotypes that are going to be in question. So for I group A, it's got to be IAIA or IAIO. For B, it's IBIB and IBIO. For blood group AB can only be one, which is IAIB, and IO can only be one, which is IOIO. Alright, so that's really how it can be. No other options for blood grouping.